Are villains too villainous? In the age of movies such as Maleficent, are we getting away from villains being and staying villains? Or are we overthinking it? Hello, everyone, and welcome to my channel. I am a multi-genre independent author, TR Sloth for all things dark, gory, and depressing, and Margot Primrose for all things romantic and swoon-worthy. Here we talk about anything and anything affecting the book community and writing and publishing tips and tricks. I'm wearing a big chunky sweater today because it is cold and raining and wet out. I've been living in Cincinnati for about 4 years now, and I've noticed that their winter, they don't get snow, they get rain. And it's chilly. It's very chilly. I don't know why, but sometimes when it's raining, it feels colder out than when it's snowing. I don't know, maybe it's just like the dampness because, snow is dry. Get my big chunky sweater on though. I feel like I should have like a pipe every time I wear this. I feel like I'm like an Oxford professor and I just need a big chunky pipe. I'll get a bubble pipe. Sokka in Avatar: The Last Airbender. All right, today we're talking about villains. So even if you're not writing like an epic fantasy such as Lord of the Rings where there's one over the top villain like Sauron or Saruman, you still have antagonists in books, right? Anything and everything has to have some sort of antagonist to drive the plot forward. Contemporary romance, Amish romance, all the way through to epic fantasy, there's got to be some sort of an antagonist. Lately, I've been noticing a trend. I've been seeing this with fellow authors talking on their social medias. I've seen this in book reviews and feedback from various editors, not specifically my editors, but other authors share feedback that they have gotten from their editors or even their beta readers regarding this topic. And I think it's something that we should dive into. And this topic is making the villains too villainous. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is, I'm going to use an example. There was this horror book that I read. I'm not going to name names because I don't want it to dive into whether or not the book was good or bad or anything like that. I'm just going to use this unnamed horror book as an example. This horror book followed a woman who encountered a cult, and this cult was formed after a serial killer. And so all of these people in this small town worship this serial killer and have holidays and traditions and all sorts of crazy stuff to honor this serial killer. Okay, so it's pretty dark, gruesome, very bloody story. Well, the whole book was the whole premise of this serial killer was that he targeted middle-aged, unmarried women without children. And it was a narrative about how society treats women. Well, the part that kind of lost me, not necessarily the book, but the community's reaction to the book that lost me was when I went through and I was reading other reviews and people were saying the author was a horrible person. The author was clearly misogynistic because all of the antagonists didn't like unmarried women. That was the point of the book. The point of the book was to showcase how society treats unmarried, middle-aged, and older women. I mean, granted, it was very much exaggerated because this serial killer cult did some very, very gruesome things to women. The town had this whole holiday where they would get together and torture and murder a small group of unmarried, middle-aged women. And the whole thing was about how the main character had been being treated like garbage before she found out about this cult. Like you see her going about her life and how she's passed over and treated, and how a lot of that stems from people basically saying, well, you should have had kids at this point, or your life would be more fulfilling if you had had kids. It wouldn't matter if I was firing you from your job for no reason if you had had kids or something else in your life to care about. So that was the entire premise of the story, was to showcase this and to showcase the misogyny and how older women can be treated. So my question is, if that was the point of the book, if that was the point of the narration, why is it a bad thing that the author showed it? That's what I don't understand about the community's reaction. And here's the other thing, is the way it was written, it was not written as a, oh, this is a good thing. We like what these people are doing. We should do it. It was painted in a very very negative light. It was not meant to be enjoyed, it was meant to make you uncomfortable. So, why then are people turning on the author for that? A lot of books are not meant to make you feel good. I hate to say it, but that's true. There's a lot of books out there that are meant to make you think or meant to make you uncomfortable, especially the villains. And so, in that case, if the author is showcasing something specific that they want to make people think about, or if they want to shine a light on the negative parts of society, like a lot of books do that. They pick something that is very negative about society and they just put a spotlight on it. And that's the point. The point is to showcase the bad and the ugly and to dig things out from under the carpet and put them under a microscope. That's what a lot of literature does. I mean, you look at things like Clockwork Orange and 1984, they weren't necessarily trying to predict the future. They were taking things that were happening in their time period and exploding them and making them more exaggerated. Like Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451. That was very much about how much Ray Bradbury hated and despised the rise of television. The man hates TV, and he wrote a whole book about it, which I think is kind of hilarious how petty that was. But it's a great book. I love that book anyway. Anyway, I digress. So, what is happening now where we read a book and the antagonists are doing something very negative that the book is highlighting? This is negative. This is how this negative action is impacting other people. And us as readers, or the reading community as a whole, is instead of saying, oh, you're right, that is bad, we're turning on the author and saying, you're a horrible person for putting this in your book. Why are you advocating for this? And I've had some of that in my own books. A lot of my horror books very much have unsubtle hints at human trafficking being a strong theme. And people really don't like that. They're talking about how I shouldn't be showcasing these things and talking. I'm not doing it because I support it. It's because I think that human trafficking is actually a global crisis that is not being talked about enough. And that's one of the reasons I put it in my books, because I'm very anti trafficking. Who would have thought? And I've seen this from other authors. I've noticed authors talking on their social medias about how they've gotten feedback saying that they needed to tone down their villains and that the villains shouldn't be doing bad things. And I really don't understand this new trend. I don't even know if it's a trend or maybe I'm just overanalyzing it or noticing it too much. But why are we now turning against villains acting like villains? I'm not saying that every villain needs to be a, cartoon character bad guy. I'm saying that sometimes in books you have bad characters doing bad things. And the main characters, sometimes they have to fight against that and rise above it. Or sometimes those bad things are shown in the book to have the after effects. So you see, oh, this is what happens to someone when they go through this, and that's why it's bad. So I don't understand this. Maybe if you have any insights on this, drop a comment and let me know, because I'm honestly a little flabbergasted, because what happened within the book world to have these morally gray complex characters and these extremely awful villains, and having good versus evil or morally gray versus evil or anything in between that. Why are we now turning against bad characters? And I'm not trying to say that there are the books where the bad characters are doing bad things and the authors or the story is painting it as good. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm specifically talking about the books and the stories where the negative actions of the villains or the antagonists are painted in a negative light. I'm not talking about the books that are glorifying bad things. That's a different conversation. I'm talking specifically about books where the bad guys are painted as bad guys, but for some reason, when people read it, they're getting it twisted and they're saying, oh, we shouldn't be showing this because if you're showing it, that means you're encouraging it. Where has this come from? I'm not understanding where this came from. I know there's been a lot of debates about media literacy and the anti-intellectualism movement. I don't know if that's part of it or not, and I don't know if that whole movement is being overblown for people to get views on their channels. I'm not getting into that. I'm staying out of that. But this is just something that I've noticed and I don't fully understand it. We should be able to have Villains and antagonists doing bad things in books and saying this is a bad action without people thinking that the author is promoting these bad actions. You can showcase the nasty, grimy, icky parts of society and human nature. Because let's face it, humans can be gross. Have you opened a history book lately? Ancient history, modern history, whatever. Humans are nasty. We get our jollies in all sorts of weird ways. So, human nature is gross. And a lot of books highlight that and they talk about human nature and they put it under a microscope and they're talking about the good and the bad and they paint the bad in a bad light. So they're not necessarily encouraging this behavior. They're not saying it's a good thing that this serial killer cult hates middle-aged women. They're just saying, hey, I want you to think about this. I want you to recognize what's happening in society and I want you to think. So there's definitely been some issues with that lately. And I always find it interesting when I read 1-star reviews of books. I like to do that, especially if it's a book that I've loved. I go through and I read 1-star reviews because I want to see what people liked and what people didn't like. It's like a type of doom scrolling, I guess. I don't know why I do it. But a lot of times the negative reviews are talking about how they don't like the author or they don't like the book because of something the villain did. The villains are supposed to be bad. They're supposed to do bad things, especially if you're doing some sort of epic fantasy or war fantasy where, it's very exaggerated. You're fighting monsters, you're fighting the big bad witch king or whoever it is. Those good versus evil highlights are going to be way exaggerated than in something that's like more of a contemporary slice of life story. But even in slice of life stories, there are horrible people walking around doing horrible things. Now, granted, I do agree that sometimes people get tunnel vision and they only think about the bad. Like that can happen a lot if you just constantly watch the news. It's all so negative and that can really affect your psyche. I get that. And not every antagonist in every book needs to be really exaggerated and really, really awful. But I don't necessarily think that there's anything wrong with having that in the book. Now, if you're marketing your book as fluffy and cozy and you open it up and the antagonist is like beating and kidnapping people and doing all these awful things, that's not fitting. So I can understand how that might be causing a disconnect. Like if you market your book as like a cozy, low stakes, and then there's this like horrible like kidnapping and torture scene, you're gonna upset your readers, okay? But if you're marketing the book as having high stakes and danger and action, or any of that, and then the bad guys are doing bad guy things, that shouldn't be throwing your readers off. That should just be fitting in with the genre. That should be expected to some extent, especially in a horror. I don't know how many times I've looked at reviews on horror books and people are like, I don't understand why this was gross and violent. I don't understand why these people were horrible. I don't know. Maybe you just want to read ghost stories, but a lot of horror books, I mean, maybe it's just me, but when I open up a horror book, I go in there expecting anything and everything to happen. Nothing in my mind is off limits when you're reading some of these horror books. Even dark fantasy. Like there's some dark fantasy or epic fantasy where I'm just like, anything could happen in here. It's okay. We'll go for this ride. Maybe that's just me. Maybe I take a little bit too much of a lax view about it or a backseat view. I'm not sure. But this is definitely something that I've noticed, and I think it could potentially be harming to our books and our authors. Because if you have authors that are trying to write a book with heavy themes about people who do bad things and painting them in a bad light, or if they're trying to showcase a specific issue that is bothering them and is forefront in their mind, but they're being punished for that. Why are they being punished for taking out the dregs of society and putting it under a microscope in their book if they're doing it in a negative light? Now, if they're doing that and they're saying, "Oh, this is actually a good thing," that's different. Keep that in mind. I'm not saying that's what I'm not what I'm talking about. That was a ramble. So I think it could be potentially very harming to books and the author community because now authors are getting afraid to write certain things. They don't want backlash. They don't want to be drug through the mud on social media. They don't want people accusing them of horrible things. I know in one of my other videos I mentioned there was an author who got accused of being a child toucher because her main character happened to have the same name as a famous minor. Okay? The internet is unhinged, and I think that that is starting to really leak into books and media and author social media, because let me tell you, when you're on there and you're trying to talk about your book and someone does a response and it goes viral and it's a very, very negative response, that can really affect you. It hasn't happened to me personally at like a viral level, but I can definitely understand how authors wouldn't want to deal with that. No one wants to deal with that drama. It's ridiculous. So I think this trend of disliking villains acting like villains or disliking antagonists doing antagonizing things could be potentially harmful, because now with social media and everything going viral and people tagging people in videos and going, this person's horrible, and they're just making all these baseless accusations, a lot of people are going to be afraid to put certain things in their books. And I'm not trying to say every book needs to have some sort of a torture scene or kidnapping scene or anything else. I'm saying that they can happen because they're real topics. They are real topics that do happen in real life. And yeah, books are supposed to mirror real life. Some of them are just fluffy escapism, and that's totally fine too. That's mirroring the happy parts of life, and there's nothing wrong with that. But not every book does that. And I think we're kind of losing that nuance perspective. And I've heard before, I heard another creator say this. I don't remember who the creator was, but they said the internet is where nuance goes to die. And honestly, I think that's what's been happening, because the internet is exploding with these book communities, which in some ways it's a good thing because books are becoming more popular. Like the written word was slowly starting to die, and then it had this huge surge back. So there's good things about books being on social media and the internet, but there's also some bad things. And I think this is definitely one of the bad things. If you're an author and you're worried about this, I understand why you're worried about it. I really do. But I think to an extent, us authors need to try and block out that noise. We need to try to block out those things where everybody is trying to tell us what to do and what not to do. Granted, you still have to write within genre expectations and market your book correctly. Like I said earlier, if you're marketing your book as cozy and low stakes and there's a big, brutal kidnapping and torture scene, that's not gonna go well. So, yes, authors, we need to try to cancel out the noise and just write the books that we want to write. Put society under a microscope or highlight just the happy parts of society. I don't care which one you want to do. Just make sure that you're being true to yourself and the stories that you want to tell. Now, as readers, I do think people need to take a step back sometimes and realize that just because an author is writing something doesn't mean they support it. I don't know how else to say that. Just because an author puts something in their book does not mean they're supporting it or advocating for it to happen. Sometimes we put things in our books because we've experienced them and they were very negative. Sometimes we put things in our books because we see it happening in society. We hear about it on the news and we think it's awful and we want to talk about it. Just because it's in our books does not mean we support it. I cannot say that any plainer than that. So I think people need to start kind of taking a step back and thinking, and maybe take a step back from the internet for a little bit. I don't know if that's the problem or not. I sound like a boomer. I sound like a boomer just blaming the internet for everything. That's not what I'm trying to do. I just legitimately don't know where this is coming from. I don't understand why people are now all of a sudden so upset about villains doing villainous things and about antagonists antagonizing. That's the point. That's why their characters are there. They're meant to drive the plot forward. They're meant to be the obstacle that the heroes have to overcome, or whatever genre you're writing in, that's gonna change. But you know what I mean. The antagonists and the protagonists have to butt heads over something. Rambled a little bit, but so if you've noticed this trend, go ahead and drop me a comment, because I'm really interested in what other people think about this, or maybe it's not a trend and I'm just overthinking it. That's entirely possible too. I have a problem with overthinking. I'm aware of it. It's okay. Not really. Or likewise, if you disagree, let me know as well. If you're one of the people who hates it when the villains are too villainous, and you're one of the ones who's writing reviews saying, I don't understand why the serial killer cult was doing cultish things, let me know your perspective. I would actually really like to know these things. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned for next time.